Welcome to the Regulatory Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi, the Faculty Chair of the Regulatory Policy Program at the Mustafa Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. Let me open with a few reminders regarding the logistics of our online seminar. We are recording this seminar and plan to post it online. So if you know of anyone who's interested, let them know that they'll be able to check this out on our YouTube channel later. We will take questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. Please click on Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type your questions. At the end of the presentation, I'll take the questions and pose them to our speaker. We're very excited to have with us today Chris Brummer to present his talk, What Do the Data Reveal About the Absence of Black Financial Regulators? Professor Brummer is the Agnes N. Research Professor at Georgetown University Law Center. He also serves as the Faculty Director of the Institute of International Economic Law. Professor Brummer has served as a member of the National Adjudicatory Council of FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and as a member of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission Subcommittee on Virtual Currencies. Professor Brummer, welcome to the Regulatory Policy Seminar.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess I'll just sort of start by, and I should have asked ahead of time. I mean, I do have some slides if you'd like, and I can show.
That'd be great.
This topic, is really important. I think obviously there's a certain kind of political and moral context after the brutal death of George Floyd, but really even the title of the article was designed with sort of in parentheses, the words Black, because I think it tells us something potentially about not just the data about Black financial regulators, but also really it's designed to at least begin us to take a journey to think about what does it tell us about financial regulation more generally. And what does it mean when you have financial regulatory policies that aren't necessarily being informed by voices and people coming from all walks of life and all of the different cultures and communities in the United States? Does this impact in some way the substantive quality, the robustness, indeed the very technocratic nature of financial regulation? Now, to get into those kinds of larger scale questions, you kind of have to do a diagnostic check, really, on financial regulators and financial regulation. And I really started off with a very basic question about really the representativeness of financial regulation in the United States. And the study that I had authored really walked us through a number of what I thought were really interesting data points. And I've been pretty gratified to see the interest. And again, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to go and sort of share my screen here to sort of start off with this larger question that we're working with, which is, basically the motivation behind the paper. Financial regulation is something that is important, and it ultimately impacts the lives of not just Americans, but also African Americans in particular. And it's useful to sort of think about what financial regulation is. Financial regulation and rules frame policies that determine how trillions of dollars in assets are regulated, how capital is allocated in society, and at what cost. Financial regulatory rules determine the extent to which corporations should serve priorities other than shareholders and to disclose information about their hiring practices and demographics. They determine how investors are protected. They go to the kind of language and warnings that have to be shared and disseminated to investors and people of very diverse backgrounds and communities across varying levels of vulnerability. And then finally, they help to determine who is afforded taxpayer-backed financial assistance in times of economic distress, and are charged with implementing critical legislation like the Fair Housing Act, the Community Reinvestment Act, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And I like to sort of frame that list because it helps, again, to underscore the fact that, when you think about financial regulatory rules, there are some kinds of rules that directly speak to certain kinds of systemic problems in society when it comes to, say, affordable housing or redlining or lending discrimination, that again are explicitly geared towards speaking to these problems of discrimination. And then you have other kinds of financial rules that are race neutral, but yet really have very important implications as to how society is structured, and literally rules that go to how the rules for capitalism are written. In that context, I'd like to say that Black regulators, and I say academics as well, matter. And I only add the academics point, and this was a presentation that I'd shared also with some of my colleagues over at Wharton, because I think that these series of questions are critical. And the regulatory community, the academic community, as well as industry, needs to have a sufficient amount of diversity in it to make sure that we're covering issues that are relevant to everyone. And here you may be familiar with her as a picture of Commissioner Sharon Bowen, but Black regulators matter because rules are designed with assumptions made about the people they're intended to protect or support. And without the input of those people, rules can be less effective and could well end up undermining as opposed to improving their welfare. And rulemaking without Blacks deprives agencies of the input and experience of those hailing from the community the financial system has, at least historically, most failed. And without a diversity of experience, regulatory priorities are more likely to be skewed or maybe uninformed, and regulatory approaches can end up serving narrow slivers of society. So my research project had two basic questions. First, what has been the historical representation been, at least across financial regulatory agencies? And then what is the current status, and by current I mean July 4th, we used a good date, July 4th, 2020, the current status of African-American participation in financial regulatory agencies. And just for the audience, I just want to take a second here to sort of emphasize two different things. The first query is, we try to target how many people have served as political appointees to the financial regulatory agencies since their inception. And then the second question is looking at not only the political appointees serving at US financial regulatory agencies on July 4th, but we also go an additional level deeper to see who or who is in that coterie of immediate deputies and consigliaries helping the political appointees fashion and execute their financial regulatory policy, right? So the idea here is that I want to find out who is in the room when it happens, to paraphrase Hamilton, who's in the room when policy happens at the leadership level. Now, the methodology was really rather straightforward and pretty simple. As I said, we were focusing on policy leadership, political appointees and those immediately responsible for hiring and those who are immediately responsible for obviously hiring the consigliaries. The data was pretty exhaustive, and we compiled a list of data from agency maintained lists. Background information was obtained from individuals' profiles on employer websites. Appointee political affiliations were not always readily accessible, as you can sort of see here from agency biographies. So we had to go through obituaries, curriculum vitae, archives of political contributions, and then senior appointees and policy advisors were identified through organizational charts on government available web pages. It's important to note that the structures of regulatory agencies were not always the same, and that's something it makes this kind of project really interesting when you're trying to compare, say, the SEC and how it's structured to, say, the Federal Reserve. But we did try to keep our analysis as simple and as consistent as possible by only tabulating individuals directly, again, chosen and approved by political appointees, especially at that second level, second tier question, as most senior advisors or as the most senior deputies in the formulation of policy or supervision. Now, there are certain kinds of limitations to the picture that my data provide, right? So this study purposely excludes executive positions, including IT, administration, minority affairs, ombudsman communications, ledge affairs, as well as general counsels and inspector generals. Now, the general counsel thing is kind of interesting because the importance of a general counsel can differ depending on, again, which regulatory agency you're kind of talking about in terms of their hand in the actual formulation of policy. But again, we're trying to aim for as much consistency as possible. And we're not looking for people beyond leadership. And the study also excludes other minorities, but I emphatically have encouraged and continue to encourage future government-sponsored research delving deeper into agency demographics. All right, so again, it's very important that people sort of understand what I'm looking for, right? I want to know who are the policy leaders in financial regulation, which drum roll, please. So, when you go to the very first question as to sort of how many have there been historically, so out of 327, you could identify 10, that's right, 10 Black political appointees to financial regulatory agencies, sort of going all the way back even, I guess in case of the Fed, even before the New Deal. Now, this list is really interesting on a number of accounts. First, that denominator of 327 has actually gotten worse over the summer because there were more appointments made and there were no, there was no diversity at all in that particular batch and no Black people. But when you sort of take a look at how people are appointed and where they're appointed, you see some of the larger agencies like the Fed appointments being rather early, sort of in the history of sort of civil rights and the civil rights movement. And then you see it sort of tapering off into sort of smaller agencies as time goes by. You also notice that when you start to think about who's getting appointed and when they're getting appointed, and this is something I really do emphasize in the paper, is that almost invariably, the appointment is made when when the president is of the same party of the individual who's seeking the appointment. Now, why is that important? Because some regulatory agencies by statute limit the number of political appointees of any one particular party. So, for example, even under the Trump administration, there were Democratic appointees made. Now, those Democratic appointees that were made in a Republican administration, or conversely, if you were going to look at the Republican appointees that were put forward during, say, Barack Obama's administration, usually those kinds of things happen when there's sponsorship in the Senate. Normally, the leader of, or the highest ranking person of the political minority helps to sort of sponsor and identify names that the president sort of signs off on, and the names then are ultimately, in some instances, particularly with the market regulators, sort of paired together, and they go forward in a joint confirmation process. Why I'm noting that is basically, if you leave the data are suggesting, at least, that if you leave the Senate to its own devices, the Senate will never put forward an African American, right? That it only happens when the president sort of goes out of his way to identify an African American for that particular slot. Now, there have been a couple of interesting exceptions, and I was so struck by it. I actually wanted to give him a call. So I actually, as I got my data, the history of these things is just fascinating. So you'll see a Mr. Harold Black here over at the National Credit Union Administration, who is actually a Republican, and he was appointed by Jimmy Carter. And by the way, this is also to highlight, this is a bipartisan problem generally, but it was very fascinating. So I called him up and I said, "Hey, sir, I think you've been kind of left out of history." And he sort of laughed and said, "Yeah, people have kind of forgotten about me." I said, well, how exactly did that happen? How exactly were you appointed? And then he said, "Well, apparently Jimmy Carter had made it a point where he said he wanted to aim to have at least one African-American on all the major financial regulatory agencies. And Mr. Black was from Georgia, and the president was from Georgia, and through some acquaintances just happened to have a connection to the president. But even so, the interesting sort of side point here is in that particular case, you still had an instance where it's the executive that's the sort of or originator, if one will, of the nomination. I just thought that was, quite fascinating. So again, the numbers are pretty bad if you're going to look at percentage-wise in terms of where the appointments have been made, and you can think of interesting stories. Some of this, it's a little bit misleading in some instances because the CFPB is a very new and young agency, the FDIC older, and the Fed and the like. But I think that the major reaction that I've gotten overwhelmingly is, wow, there are a lot of zeros. And I say, yes, there are a lot of zeros in my report. And when you dig down into the staffing as well, as of July 4th, for example, if you're going to look at a lot of the major regulatory agencies, sorry, let me just take my time here. When you begin then to switch to the second part of the analysis, thinking, well, all right, that's the historical numbers, but maybe things are a little better now that we're sort of in sort of a modern age. And especially when you start to dig a level deeper into whom those particular individuals are hiring to support them in the execution of their policy, and it doesn't get any better. And it's not in the data, but other people have done other kinds of studies. Even if you're going to look at the Fed, I've read that out of something like 400 economists at the Fed, only one is Black. There are problems when it comes to the staffing of many of our regulatory agencies. Now, immediately, I don't have a graph for this, but it is in the Brookings report. Immediately, many of you will likely say, well, this is just because we're in the Trump administration, perhaps, or it's an ideological issue. And so therefore, should we be surprised to see this particular set of data? And so I wanted to kind of test that hypothesis. I'll just switch here for a second since it's not on this chart. So I wanted to sort of test that hypothesis. And the way in which I wanted to test the hypothesis was to look at the nominees, sort of who was hired by the nominees at the CFTC and the SEC in their offices. Because then I have a kind of natural experiment. I can see, well, whom have the Democratic nominees hired to be their consigliaries, and who have the Republicans hired to be their consigliaries. And when you look across the SEC and the CFTC for the number of Black people, the answer is 0. In other words, that the Democratic nominees didn't hire any Black people, and neither did the Republicans, and showing a kind of a blind spot, regardless as to whether or not they were progressive or Trump people, and as a result, it's not an easy problem just to boil down to any particular. If you're using that sample, you can't say it's immediately an ideological issue. I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. I know those are just important points to kind of break through so that people can understand the data. So I'm just going to jump here and say, one easy way to explain some of this, particularly on the political appointee level, is to say, well, often with the financial regulatory agencies, people pull their staff, right? In other words, someone who's worked on the banking committee will get plucked by a Democratic or Republican member of that committee and then given an appointment as a commissioner at the SEC or the CFTC. And the simple answer is that my data show that although that is a useful observation, because the Senate staffs are not particularly diverse, it's certainly not explanatory in and of itself, since there are plenty of white people who get posts and who don't have Senate staffing experience even where with Black people, that's much rarely going to be the case. So the paper sort of ends by trying to figure out, well, why do we have the data? Like, why do we have this particular outcome? Again, it's a bipartisan problem. What's going on? And so I want to sort of test a couple of hypotheses. Most often people will say, well, what about qualifications? And, so I decided to just do a quick check as to the academic background of the African-American nominees versus the field. And not always, but in most of the really, particularly when you get to the higher education metrics, the African-American appointees have actually been more academically qualified with more or higher numbers of degrees than their white counterparts and non-Black counterparts, sort of spilling into this very long-held assumption that you have to be twice as good for half the job. When you then go to other kinds of theories, if it's not a qualifications argument, maybe there's a disqualification argument. Maybe where you may work may hurt you. So if you're working for Wall Street, or if you're working for a tech company or something, maybe that is going to ding everybody. But because of the racial wealth gap and income gap, more Black people who are credentialed have higher student debt and higher family obligations, and therefore they're forced to hop into these jobs. And as a result, there's a larger number of people who are kind of dinged for being identified as insufficiently committed to the cause of financial regulation and prudential oversight and investor protection. Then there's the theory of maybe cognitive bias, anchoring in terms of ideas that many of the decision makers have about the qualifications of African Americans. The outsider bias could certainly come into play. I mean, when you see new people and you're a little bit more suspicious of them. And I don't want to, I've tried not to offer any of these as fully explanatory, because the goal of my research was just to gather data. It's just that I know that it's inevitable that people sort of ask about potential venues and areas for future research. I do want to just sort of get back to sort of the original question, since this is an academic setting, about this particular issue, and I think it's entirely important. This question took too long to be asked. Like, it's kind of ridiculous that I did this in 2020, and the nature of the project in and of itself, and the response, and I got this from a lot of reporters too, who are like, Chris, you're putting us to shame. Like, literally, someone said, you're just putting us to shame. And the fact that our political science departments and our law schools and our business schools and our public policy schools never asked such a foundational, basic question, it really tells us, or should tell us, something about, or at least make us ask certain questions about how rigorous is the research that we're doing, especially when we're missing these kinds of basic questions that quite frankly can impact the entire conversation about financial regulation, right? Like, if you don't know who's in the room and who's designing the policies, then how can you really have a thoughtful and fully technocratic conversation about everything from the normative agenda that people put forward all the way to whether or not the financial rules and regulations are ultimately speaking to and achieving those goals. And I, given, since being in the family of our academic family, it's a really, it's a real yellow flag at the least. And I think it should really serve for some kind of impetus to think about the diversity in our faculties. It's not just a problem for economists, but also, again, for our business schools and business law faculties.
Professor Brummer, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for undertaking research. It's interesting you described it. It's a basic question, right? It's like we first just want to do some, as you noted, some diagnostics, and of course the thing is, I think what you've done is in this paper doing something that is fairly basic, but opens eyes to people who, for a variety of reasons, which may be related to some of the biases on your very last slide, on why they're not asking the question in the first place. So I've already received several questions about this. Before we go to those questions, though, I do want to go to our colleague, Hal Jackson of Harvard Law School, who's done a lot of work in financial regulation, who has joined us again as a commentator, second time this semester. Thank you, Hal, as well as being a presenter in the seminar series in the past. Let me also remind everyone that you can use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. I'll start to go through those after Hal makes his initial comments. I also want to remind everyone we need to end a few minutes early today. For those of you at the Kennedy School, you know we have an event with the dean that starts at 1 o'clock. So I want to make sure that we can all jump from one Zoom room to the next for that. But with that, let me go now to Hal.
Great. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Chris, for coming back and presenting this paper. You know, oftentimes when you're having a discussion about a working paper, there's a question about will it have an impact? And that's actually often a very good question to ask. In this case, the paper already has had an impact. It's lots of reporters, other people. There's been lots of events. This is very much front of mind and a lot of people's you know, thinking about, you know, particularly the next administration. But I think this is you know, real kudos to Chris for doing this. I have a couple of, you know, sort of technical questions. When I spoke to Chris about this paper last, it was kind of not yet released, and there were methodological issues, you know, mostly about whether the structure of the inquiries were, particularly for the political appointees, was done in a way that it was getting, you know, comprehensive results. And I have to say, at least as far as I have heard, there haven't been people coming back and saying you missed somebody. And so I think that this is, you know, and occasionally an empirical technique is to sort of, you can validate yourself by the absence of objections, or at least the quantification of objections.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
So I won't say who, but let's just say there have been some very high level people, you know, who are like, you know, who very kindly, you know, would sort of reach out and sort of say, so did you think about so-and-so? And I'm like, here. and or more often than not, you know, because it's a hard question asking people, you know, and sometimes, you know, it doesn't really make anyone feel great, you know, but more often than not, let's say people were identified who were in administrative posts, right? And were not involved, and they may be African-American, but again, the question, I asked a hard question,
yeah.
Right? I mean, the research wasn't hard to you know, to get that data, but I asked a hard question, an uncomfortable question, which is when it comes to why we have a regulatory agency in the first place, which is to design and implement ways to execute policy, who's doing that? You know, and that's all I want to know.
Yeah. No, I think this totally speaks to your thesis, but I think that to the extent that you have an opportunity to update, I think a little bit of a you know, a codicil or something about what, you know, what came in and how it, you know, in some sense validated or, you know, refined your thinking. That's an interesting way, because, you know, empirical work of this sort is hard to do. I also think another piece that I would be very interested in is, you know, your discussion of folks that were included and how they got included is super interesting. There's a category of people that I think are also quite interesting, which are the minorities that got on the short list. So the marginal cases are often super interesting. And I imagine there's some that were passed over, but just, you know, who were those people and what kept them from going over the top? And also there may have been some people that, you know, decided that for financial or some other reason, they just didn't want to do it. But I think, you know, always the best place to look for, you know, policy improvements is at the margin, because those are the people that are easiest to push over. And so to the extent you can ever do that, I think it's interesting. You know, two other just general comments. it's conceivable. It would be amazing, but it's conceivable that your paper is enough to kind of, now that you've measured it, it's an agenda item. But I worry a little bit about the ability of people to forget. And so, I think that one of the things you might want to think about is, okay, where do we put this request? And agencies do annual performance requests every year. And, you can just look at corporate annual reports and shareholder requests for diversity information. And I just sort of think, a wholesale solution, so you don't have to embarrass Joe in the Kennedy School in the future, is to kind of just get incorporated into the the chief financial officer reports each year what their diversity data is at, the top level. It's not difficult, but the second tier, and frankly, I think the third tier is the pipeline. But just sort of thinking about what should be the ask, and it's conceivable that someone in the House of Representatives might find this an interesting thing to put into some appropriation bills, but that would sort of just work across the government and get a wholesale solution. The one other thing I would just say, and this is, it's maybe not a little, it's not fair, but this business of going to the Senate staff as the place to look, and I get by including that you have put the staff directors are now going to be, maybe we should be having reports from staff directors about what their staffs look like, but I just want to push back any presumption that the Senate staff or House staff is the place to go. Because I think a real shortcoming of financial regulatory agencies now is there's too many staffers that, every issue they see initially through a political lens. And, there's challenges in other places, but to the extent that you at all are implying that the Hill is the place to look for good regulators, that I would like to dissent from that aspect of an otherwise admirable paper. But the main thing I want to say is this is really great work, and I'm glad it's getting such a wide attention.
So just so I had to sort of include that as a theory. Number one, it's just interesting to test. I mean, just because I was curious myself, and living here in Washington, D.C., that is the go-to explanation, right? Well, Chris, it's because the staff over at the Senate aren't diverse, and that's how it happens. So regardless as to sort of it's whether or not it's a normatively sort of optimal outcome, I just wanted to test to see how accurate how much explanatory power that particular theory had, and it had some, but not very much, or certainly a limited amount of explanatory power. And to the normative point, I did gently sort of include either language, maybe even a footnote, sort of saying that whether or not you should go to the Senate is a highly contested, choice for choosing people to develop policy. But I certainly appreciate your perspective. And on the chief financial officer reports, I think that's a really interesting suggestion. I mean, we do have something like the OMWI reports that are annual, but the data is not always disaggregated. It doesn't go into the kind of detail that, frankly, this report does. And thinking through whether or not legislatively or otherwise more artisanal data should be requested of our regulatory agencies is, I think, an excellent suggestion.
Great. Thank you, Hal. Chris, a lot of what you said here focuses on questions, I think, about both the pipeline. In fact, this discussion about looking at Senate staffers is trying to look at one part, potentially, of the pipeline of who ends up in a position in a financial regulatory agency, but also a question of champions. That, in a sense, there aren't any champions in Congress when we think about their role in trying to nominate individuals to these positions. So curious to hear your take on, now that you've done sort of this initial diagnostic, What is it when we sort of think about pipeline? Do we need to have a broader sense about what's in the pipeline? Do we also need to think about like what if we had champions? If we had, I've heard like if we have a few more role models, that makes it easier to attract people, whether it's in a conventional pipeline or if we take a broader approach to what should be the pipeline for future regulators.
That's such an important question. I mean, I look at my own sort of life and career, like in business law, and luckily every once in a while I could bug Howell about things, but as a general matter, from a sort of productivity placement kind of thing, like if you're the senior Black business law professor at 33, that's insane. And not knowing exactly how you should be doing the job of that position, which means more than just that job. And I think that when it comes to financial regulatory posts, just like in corporate America, it's really no different. And very often, I think in the private sector, people will say, look for champions who don't necessarily look like you, because frankly, there won't be anyone who looks like you. The issue is to what degree are prospective champions, whether at the Senate or elsewhere, are entirely interested and motivated and driven by motivations to make them champions. When you talk about any particular sort of actor in politics or in policy, they have priors. People have alliances. They have sort of established ways of viewing the world, and they kind of have to, because that's how they get things done. When you do, however, broaden the pool, right, and you introduce new people who don't necessarily behave the way that you do or necessarily have the same kinds of thinking about different issues, that's sometimes, people view that as a friction, even though what it actually does is to enhance the quality of your policy. And I think that what we're just now beginning is a process of educating many people, particularly the policymakers, about a conversation that ironically has been one 20 years, 30 years in the making when you get to the private sector. It's absurd that Goldman Sachs is more diverse than the history of our financial regulatory leadership. I mean, it's absurd that it's taken this long to have a conversation about literally how the rules for capitalism are designed. I mean, it's when you sort of sit back and think about it, I mean, like it's just kind of shocking. And as I said, with this paper, and I've told plenty of people, the paper is almost like telling someone, spending 30 pages going through the data and getting very extensive data to tell people that the sky is blue, when actually all you had to do was look up, right? And the outcome of the paper, if you've taken any time to look at our financial regulatory leadership since the New Deal, is unambiguous. And so it really didn't, I mean, there's almost like a transaction cost of progress, which is, okay, it's a pretty obvious thing that we need to do something, but fine, let's go ahead and compile the data to show people how bad it is so they can see a lot of zeros. And my hope is, because it is a cost, to put the time in to get something done that is so foundational and so important to the country. And it's so important to the economic lives of so many people, that hopefully we, either this paper and hopefully it won't take too many more to inspire people to be those mentors. But like Howell, I do, and I am sometimes concerned. I am concerned about forgetfulness. and institutions like Harvard are critical to maintaining and keeping that conversation going. This is a kind of research that has very direct, very practical implications for how all Americans live. Because I tell people, when you think about financial regulation, it's like the ultimate consumer-facing good. Just like money. Even when you don't have it, it impacts you, right? And so how you think about it, there's something in it for everyone. And just like if you're going to create a kind of banking financial regulatory regime and never ask, whether or not you trust them or you don't, you kind of want to ask a bank, well, what do you think about this financial regulation? Just to sort of get some clue as to what they're thinking. It seems anachronistic, to say the least, that we're not asking all sort of sectors of society what they're thinking about financial regulatory rules. And so what this is hopefully kickstarting that conversation. And I've heard a lot. And by the way, I've heard a lot from Democrats and I've heard a lot from Republicans, because the numbers really are not, they're so depressing that they're not controversial, and so everyone understands that they have to kind of grapple with it. But how forgetful will people be? Is a big question.
So Chris, you noted about how, whether it's Goldman Sachs, other parts of, say, the business community has been grappling with this for some time. I'd like to go back and talk a little bit about Congress, because it did jump out at me. Perhaps this reflects my bias as someone who used to work in the executive branch. But the thing that struck me is that Congress is just not anywhere to be seen here in the data.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the challenge, of course, is Congress sets its own rules on everything, whether it's how they do voting or even employment law. They have a different set of rules than everybody else. They set them. They often have significant deference to the members and the chairs of committee and so on. So I'm wondering whether or not there could be some ways we could try to change the congressional process, and maybe it's through some nudges, maybe it's, and the thing that came to mind, and it may be a very poor analog, perhaps as a reflection of the fact that I spent Sunday afternoons watching football with my dad. But one thing, for better or worse, whenever there is a head football coach hired now, there's discussion in the NFL, there's discussion of the Rooney Rule.
Yes, yeah.
Like if we just had something like that where we say, look, we want to make sure that your short list seriously considered African Americans, other underrepresented minorities, that you're taking this seriously, that we want to hear all the voices of our society. Is there a way to sort of put pressure to make public, yes, we want something like that in how we go about thinking about who we nominate, whether it's for financial regulation, but it's relevant in other contexts as well.
Right, just like basically the don't be lazy rule, right? It's like, if you're actually going to do, try to find the best people, why not just, I don't know, take the time to interview enough people to make sure that you're hiring the best people. And, and I want to say, part of that conversation is also the public discourse. It's how the press covers things, when they put out names of people, there are a lot of very talented people of color, a lot of talented Black people who can do lots of things. And are you being fair? In your coverage and in terms of your own expectations of them, and by the way, this is something, you have to do in hiring across the country. And it's something that has to be embedded in congressional practices. It has to be embedded in how the press covers financial regulation and discussions of financial regulators and who's being considered. And I think as a structural matter, Wall Street and others are thinking about the Rooney Rule and the Mansfield Rule, questions that force people to, in effect, not be lazy. And I think that again, either legislatively or through some kind of congressional practice, through a code of conduct, there are lots of ways to sort of get to this. the challenge is in part, just as financial regulators have to know about this stuff, part of what I feel and what I try to do myself is to make sure that underrepresented groups and communities understand as well just how important this is. We're living in a world where it's very easy when if the police beat you up or worse, to understand the necessity and the importance of reform of our criminal justice system or policing or like, people kind of get that. If they see it, they're like, okay, this impacts me. Trying to make the argument and try to tell someone, why it's really important, why it'd be great to have a black head of the Fed or the SEC, that's not necessarily part of people's immediate reality. However, I think people are, and it's not even I think, in a conversation about economic justice, economic equality, the beeline between economic empowerment and how people are viewed and treated, even when it comes to their fundamental civil rights, that's something that's become extremely clear, and it's become more urgent. And so I do think that even that there's, as I think, I know that there's a lot more attention even on the Hill, even among minority members of the Hill in the Senate and the Vice President-elect, attention being directed towards this very issue. You can just sort of see from all the bills that have been sort of released over the last year or two.
So is it something we need to legislate, or I hazard to use this term, norms? Do we need to think about how we create new norms? But that does raise questions about whether norms change, norms are violated, or norms are ignored. So if you were to think through, like, here's how we need to make sure we make progress on this in the future. Is it something where we just need to say, hey, we just need to nail down a piece of legislation to make this happen?
I'm hesitant to say that, because I'm I can think of a number of extraordinarily influential ways to begin to get at this issue, right? You're talking to someone who is a scholar, as Howell will know, of something called soft law, which is a form for those of you who do international economic diplomacy. It's a formally non-binding form of regulation, but one that can still have an extraordinary compliance pool. And so how the design of the actual instrument for achieving greater diversity in this space, there are different ways to get at it, and I'm thinking very hard about it as a researcher, and thinking through how that would work, as really the kinds of a follow-on for this kind of research. But at this point in time, I think I'm going to just also encourage the many brilliant people who are watching this webinar at Harvard to also think for themselves, about the toolbox that is available for really achieving the kinds of moral aspirations that are also critical to a sustainable economy.
So I think it's a really important call to action, both for how we think about policy and how we think about research that can inform future policy. So I really appreciate that.
For the aspiring academics and researchers, and for people who are already researchers, just take one moment to think about, in this particular instance, this has been a big paper, and it's such a basic question. Think about how many other entirely basic questions there are to be answered, and the mark you can make just asking really simple questions that for lots of different reasons haven't been asked. And at the same time, you can make a real impact on the world as well as on the world of ideas.
Well, it may be a simple question. It is clearly driving a conversation that continues. Let's hope that it drives change as we move into 2021. I think there are some opportunities hopefully becoming available to us as we think about a new administration, and that we in government, whether it's in the new administration, working with Congress and elsewhere, we take some lessons from 2020 and move forward on this. But the key thing is what Chris has done has started a conversation, and we need to make sure that it continues. So let me know before we wrap up that this is the final regulatory policy seminar of the semester. So I invite you to email me with suggestions for speakers for the spring seminar series. We'll soon begin scheduling the spring semester schedule, and we'll be posting that in January on our website. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Scott Liedelen and Victoria Groves-Cardillo, for all their fantastic support throughout the seminar series this semester, so that we can make this work online. We'd rather be in Bell Hall, but we've actually done, I think, quite an effective job continuing these kinds of conversations in our seminar series via Zoom. I'd like to thank Hal for joining us today. And I really appreciate, Professor Brummer, you joining us today. I know your schedule is quite busy. It's going to be getting busier. Appreciate the service you are providing for the president-elect. And with that, I'd like to wish everybody a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.